Some wounds run so deep that only someone who's carried the same pain can truly understand. In the dusty town of Cedar Ridge, a black stallion with scars covering his body had kicked away every cowboy who tried to tame him. For 3 weeks, the best horse trainers had failed. Buck Morrison lasted 8 seconds. Young Tommy Fletcher hit the dirt before his boots touched the stirrups. Even old Jake Patterson walked away defeated. The stallion's eyes held a wildness born of cruelty. His scars told a story of suffering no animal should endure. When he reared up on his hind legs, muscles rippling beneath his midnight coat, even the bravest men stepped back from the corral fence. Then a mute cowboy stepped into the dusty street. He moved quietly, like someone who knew what it meant to hurt. What could gentle hands accomplish where force had failed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel Cartwright hadn't spoken a word in 7 years, but his presence in Cedar Ridge spoke volumes. At 42, he carried himself with the deliberate movements of a man who'd learned to communicate through action rather than words. His weathered hands told stories of hard work, and his grey eyes held depths that most folks found unsettling, not because they were unkind, but because they seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. He'd arrived in Cedar Ridge 3 months prior, riding a gentle mare named Grace and carrying nothing but a worn saddlebag and a leather journal that never left his side. The journal's pages were filled with careful script, thoughts and observations penned in the evening hours when most men would be sharing stories over whiskey. Samuel wrote instead of speaking, observed instead of participating, and somehow managed to make himself invaluable to the community without uttering a single syllable. Ezra Blackwood, the town's blacksmith, had been the first to take a chance on the silent stranger. A bear of a man with arms like tree trunks and a heart bigger than his massive chest, Ezra had watched Samuel gentle his own skittish horse with patience that bordered on miraculous. When Ezra's mare had developed a limp that had the town's veterinarian stumped, Samuel had simply knelt beside the animal, running his hands along her leg with the sensitivity of a physician. He'd found a small stone lodged between her shoe and hoof, something so simple that everyone else had missed it. "Man's got a gift," Ezra had declared to anyone who'd listen, his booming voice echoing through his smithy. "Horses trust him like he's speaking their language." The truth was, Samuel understood the language of pain better than most. Animals sensed it in him, the quiet ache that lived behind his steady gaze, the way he moved through the world, as if carrying an invisible weight. They recognized him as one of their own, a creature who'd been hurt and learned to survive despite it. Mary Sullivan ran the town's only saloon, but calling it just a saloon undersold what she'd created. The Copper Dollar was part tavern, part boarding house, and part sanctuary for anyone who needed a hot meal and a listening ear. At 38, Mary had auburn hair that caught the lamplight and green eyes that missed nothing. She'd been watching Samuel since his arrival, noting how he always left exact change on her bar, how he nodded politely to every patron, and how he seemed to appear whenever someone needed help. She'd seen him assist old Mrs. Reger, Henderson with her groceries, steady drunk Charlie Moss before he fell off his horse, and spend an entire afternoon helping young Pete Murphy muck out the stables when the boy had injured his shoulder. Samuel never asked for recognition or payment, simply did what needed doing, and disappeared back into the background of the town's daily rhythm. Pete Murphy was 16 and filled with the restless energy of youth, but he'd taken to following Samuel around like a devoted puppy. The boy had lost his father to consumption 2 years prior and had been struggling to keep his family's small livery stable running ever since. Samuel had begun showing up each morning to help with the horses, and somehow Pete's business had started thriving again. The animals were calmer, healthier, and more responsive than they'd ever been. "He don't talk, but he teaches me things every day," Pete confided to Mary one evening as she served him his usual glass of milk. "Shows me how to read what the horses are feeling, how to move around them so they ain't scared. It's like he can see inside them somehow." Samuel's gift with animals had become something of local legend, which made the arrival of the Black Stallion all the more intriguing. The horse had been brought in by a cattle drive passing through town, its driver claiming he'd found the animal wandering alone on the plains. The man had taken one look at the horse's condition, the network of scars across its flanks, the wild terror in its eye sand, known he couldn't handle such a damaged creature. "Name's Thunder," the drover had said, though he admitted he'd given the horse that name himself. "Found him 3 days ago, nearly dead from thirst. Got some water in him, but he won't let nobody close. Figure maybe someone in town might have use for him." The scars on Thunder's body told a story that made even hardened cowboys wince. Long welts across his back suggested a whip used with cruel frequency. Circular marks on his flanks looked like burn scars from a branding iron applied carelessly or maliciously. Most disturbing were the cuts around his mouth, evidence of a bit forced with brutal efficiency, leaving permanent reminders of human cruelty. When Thunder had been led into the town's main corral, his arrival had drawn a crowd. The animal was magnificent, despite his wounds, 17 hands of pure muscle and power, with a coat so black it seemed to absorb light. His mane flowed like dark water, and when he moved, there was a grace that spoke of noble bloodlines. But his eyes held a fury that made grown men step backward. The townspeople had watched in fascination and horror, as one experienced cowboy after another had tried to approach the animal. Each attempt ended the same way. Thunder would tolerate the human's presence for a few moments, then explode into violent motion, hooves flashing and teeth bared, sending his would-be handler scrambling for safety. Buck Morrison had arrived from the neighboring town with his reputation preceding him. A man who'd broken horses for cattle barons across 3 states. Buck approached Thunder with the confidence of someone who'd never met an animal he couldn't handle. He'd lasted exactly 8 seconds long enough to get a rope around Thunder's neck before the stallion had spun and launched him across the corral like a rag doll. Tommy Fletcher, barely 20 and eager to prove himself, had tried speed and agility. His plan had been to vault onto Thunder's back before the horse knew what was happening. Thunder had known exactly what was happening and had expressed his opinion by bucking Tommy into the dirt before the young man's feet had even cleared the ground. Old Jake Patterson had brought wisdom and patience to his attempt. At 65, Jake had gentled more wild horses than anyone in the territory, using methods passed down from his grandfather, who'd learned from Plains Indians. He'd spent 2 hours just standing near the corral, letting Thunder grow accustomed to his presence, speaking in low, soothing tones. When he'd finally entered the corral, moving with the slow deliberation of age and experience, Thunder had seemed almost calm. For nearly 10 minutes, Jake had stood in the center of the corral while Thunder circled him, snorting and pawing but not attacking. The crowd had begun to murmur that maybe the old-timer would succeed where others had failed. Then Jake had extended his hand, palm up, the traditional offering of peace between man and horse. Thunder's response had been swift and decisive. The stallion had charged, not to strike but to intimidate, stopping just inches from Jake's face and screaming, a challenge that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Even Jake, with all his experience, had backed down from the raw fury in those dark eyes. "That horse has been broken in the worst possible way," Jake had told the gathered crowd afterward, his usually steady voice shaking slightly. "Someone did terrible things to him. He don't trust humans, and I can't say I blame him." Samuel had watched each attempt from the shadows, never moving closer to the crowd, but never looking away from Thunder. Something in the stallion's defiance called to him the way the animal stood alone in the center of the corral, magnificent and untouchable, carrying his pain like armor against a world that had shown him only cruelty. In his journal that night, Samuel had written, "Saw myself today in the eyes of a wounded horse. We are both creatures made dangerous by the kindness we cannot trust. But perhaps that is exactly why we might understand each other." The next morning, as the town stirred to life with the familiar sounds of merchants opening their shops and children running to school, Samuel stood at the corral fence with his journal tucked under his arm. Thunder stood at the far end of the enclosure, watching him with suspicious eyes. The 2 damaged souls regarded each other across 30 feet of dusty ground, each recognizing something familiar in the other's careful stillness. Samuel pulled a worn apple from his pocket not as an offering, but simply as a sign of peaceful intent. He placed it on the fence post and stepped back, making no move to approach. Thunder's ears flicked forward, the first sign of curiosity the animal had shown since his arrival. For an hour, Samuel simply stood there, not speaking because he couldn't, not moving because he understood that trust was something that had to be offered freely. When he finally walked away, the apple remained untouched on the post. But something had shifted between Thema recognition that perhaps healing was possible, even for the most wounded among them. The stranger rode into Cedar Ridge on a Tuesday morning like a shadow falling across the sun. Silas Kane was the kind of man who announced his presence without saying a word, tall and lean, with pale eyes that held no warmth and a smile that never reached them. His horse, a nervous bay gelding, stepped sideways constantly, as if trying to distance itself from its rider. Kane dismounted outside the Copper Dollar and tied his horse with movements that were just a little too rough, a little too quick. The animal flinched away from his touch, and that small gesture told Samuel everything he needed to know about the man's character. Samuel was sitting on the saloon's front steps, carving a piece of wood while keeping one eye on Thunder's corral across the street. "Heard you folks got my horse," Kane said to no one in particular, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His gaze swept the street until it landed on Thunder, and something predatory flickered in his expression. "That's him, all right. Black as sin and twice as stubborn." Mary emerged from the saloon, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd learned to read men quickly in her line of work, and everything about Kane set her teeth on edge. "That horse has been here 3 weeks, she said carefully. "Drover, who brought him, said he found him wandering alone." Kane's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Wandering, was he? That animal's worth more than most men make in a year. I've been tracking him since he broke free from my ranch in Texas. Killed 2 of my men trying to catch him again." The way he said it, casual, matter-of-fact, made Mary's stomach turn. Samuel's hands stilled on his carving, though he didn't look up from the wood. "Got papers to prove ownership," Kane continued, patting a leather pouch at his belt. "Bill of sale, breeding records, the whole lot. That horse belongs to me, and I'll be taking him home." Pete Murphy had been leading one of the livery horses to water when Kane arrived, and the boy froze at the stranger's words. In the 3 weeks since Thunder's arrival, Pete had watched Samuel work patiently with the stallion, had seen the gradual softening in the animal's defensive posture. The idea of Thunder being dragged back to whatever hell he'd escaped from made the boy's chest tight with anger. "Horse seems pretty settled here," Pete said, his young voice cracking slightly. "Maybe he don't want to go back." Kane turned those pale eyes on the boy, and Pete instinctively stepped backward. "What a horse wants ain't particularly relevant to me, son. Property is property, and that animal is mine by law." Samuel finally looked up from his carving, meeting Kane's gaze across the dusty street. For a long moment, the 2 men studied each other, the silent cowboy with his gentle hands and the cold-eyed stranger who spoke of horses like objects. Kane's expression shifted slightly, something calculating entering his features. "You the one who's been playing with my horse?" Kane asked, taking a step closer to Samuel. "Heard there's some mute fool thinks he can gentle anything with 4 legs. Samuel stood slowly, his carved Pisa small horse cradled in his palm. He was slightly shorter than Kane, but broader through the shoulders, and he moved with the kind of controlled grace that suggested he'd be dangerous if provoked. Still, he said nothing. Kane's smile widened, showing teeth that were too sharp. "Cat got your tongue, cowboy, or maybe something else took it." He gestured toward Thunder's corral. "That horse has killed before. Stomped a stable hand to death back in Texas when the boy got too friendly. Animal's got a taste for violence. Now only way to handle him is with a firm hand and a strong whip." The casual cruelty in Kane's words made Mary step forward protectively, positioning herself between the stranger and Samuel. "There's no need for threats, mister. If you have legal claim to the horse, we'll respect that. But there's no call for violence or intimidation." Kane's attention shifted to Mary, and his gaze traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Pretty little thing, aren't you? Running this place all by yourself must get lonely. Samuel's hand moved to the knife at his belt knot, threateningly, but with the kind of unconscious readiness that spoke of ingrained protective instincts. Cain noticed the movement and chuckled. "Easy there, silent man. I'm not looking for trouble, just want what's mine." Cain pulled a leather portfolio from his saddlebag and extracted several documents. Bill of sale from the Brennan Ranch in Austin, breeding papers showing his bloodline. And this, he held up a cruel-looking bridle studded with metal spikes, his proper tack. He's been trained to this particular bit, won't respond to anything else. Samuel's eyes fixed on the bridle, and his face went pale. The metal spikes were stained dark with old blood, and the leather showed wear patterns that spoke of violent struggle. This was an instrument of torture, not training, designed to cause pain with every movement of the horse's head. Mary gasped when she saw it. "That's barbaric. No wonder the poor animal doesn't trust people." "Effective," Cain corrected. "That horse was running wild with a herd of mustangs when I caught him. Took months to break his spirit proper." This bridle was the only thing that got through to him. He coiled the reins with practiced efficiency. "Course, he's been running free for weeks now. Probably thinks he can go back to his wild ways. I'll need to remind him who's boss." Thunder had noticed Cain's arrival and was pacing restlessly in his corral, his agitation growing with each word the man spoke. The stallion's ears were pinned back against his skull, and he was snorting challenge calls that carried clearly across the street. Even from a distance, the horse seemed to recognize his tormentor. Samuel watched Thunder's distress and felt an answering tension coil in his own chest. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd spent hours near the corral, never approaching directly but simply being present, allowing the horse to grow accustomed to his quiet companionship. He'd seen Thunder's defensive posture soften slightly, had watched the stallion's ears prick forward with curiosity instead of flattening with fear. Now, with Cain's arrival, all that progress was evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. "I'll be taking him today," Cain announced, folding his papers and tucking them back into his pouch. "Need to get him back to Texas before he forgets all his training completely. Already lost enough time chasing him across 3 territories." Samuel stepped forward then, his movement deliberate and unmistakable. He positioned himself between Cain and the path to Thunder's corral note aggressively, but with quiet determination. His message was clear even without words. He would not allow this cruelty to continue. Cain's eyes narrowed. "You got something to say, mute man? Because I'm getting real tired of people in this town thinking they can interfere with my business." Samuel reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small piece of paper. He handed it to Mary, who unfolded it and read aloud. "That horse has been hurt enough. There are other ways." Cain's laugh was genuinely amused this time. "Other ways? You think you can train a killer horse with kindness and sweet words? That animal is dangerous, and the only thing he understands is strength. I've got the scars to prove it." He rolled up his sleeve, revealing long white marks across his forearm, claw marks from Thunder's hooves. "Nearly took my arm off the first time I tried to saddle him. Learned real quick that he only respects force." Samuel studied the scars, then looked toward Thunder's corral. The stallion was still pacing, his agitation increasing by the minute. Samuel could see the animal's muscles bunching and releasing with nervous energy, could read the signs of a creature preparing to fight or flee. In his mind, Samuel began forming the words he wished he could speak. Those scars weren't earned through training, they were earned through cruelty. That horse wasn't fighting because he was wild, he was fighting because he was afraid. And fear, once planted deep enough, can take a lifetime to root out. But Samuel's voice had been silenced 7 years ago, lost in a moment of spiritual crisis that had shattered his faith in both God and his own purpose. So instead of speaking, he simply nodded toward Cain's scars and then gestured to Thunder's flanks, drawing a parallel that needed no words to understand. Cain's expression darkened. "You comparing my training methods to animal abuse? That horse came to me half dead and worthless. I made him valuable. I made him strong." Samuel pulled out his journal and wrote quickly, then showed the page to Mary. She read, Strength built through fear is not strength at all, it's a different kind of breaking. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Kane's hand moved instinctively to the whip coiled at his belt. You got a lot of opinions for a man who can't speak them himself. Maybe someone should teach you when to keep your thoughts to yourself. Mary stepped closer to Samuel, her chin raised defiantly. This is a civilized town, Mr. Kane. We don't settle disputes with violence. Civilized, Kane repeated as if the word amused him. Lady, I've been from California to the Carolinas, and I ain't found a truly civilized place yet. Everywhere you go, it's the strong taking from the weak. That's the natural order. He looked directly at Samuel then, his pale eyes holding a cold challenge. I'll give you credit. Mute Manu got heart, standing up like this. But heart don't change facts, and the fact is that horse belongs to me. I'll be back tomorrow morning with the sheriff to collect what's mine. If anyone tries to interfere, he let the threat hang unfinished. Samuel watched Kane mount his nervous bay and ride out of town, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with tension and unspoken fear. Thunder had pressed himself against the far side of the corral, as far from where Kane had stood as possible, his great body trembling with remembered terror. Pete approached Samuel cautiously. You ain't gonna let him take Thunder, are you? That man's evil, you can see it in his eyes. Samuel looked at the boy's earnest face, then at Mary's worried expression, and finally at Thunder's terrified form across the street. In his journal, he wrote a single sentence that would change everything. Some battles choose us, whether we're ready or not. The die had been cast. Tomorrow would bring a reckoning that Samuel had spent 7 years trying to avoid, a confrontation that would force him to decide whether his silence was truly a choice or simply another form of cowardice. And at the center of it all stood a damaged horse whose fate would determine not just his own future, but Samuel's as well. The hours after Kane's departure felt heavy with anticipation, like the air before a thunderstorm. Samuel found himself unable to concentrate on anything except the knowledge that tomorrow might be Thunder's last day of freedom. He stood at his small room's window above Mary's saloon, looking down at the corral where the stallion paced restlessly in the moonlight. Unable to sleep, Samuel descended the stairs and stepped into the cool night air. His boots made soft sounds on the wooden walkway as he approached Thunder's enclosure. The horse noticed him immediately, ears swiveling forward with alert attention, rather than the defensive posture he showed to others. Can't sleep either, Samuel thought, though the words remained locked inside him where they'd been trapped for 7 long years. The silence that had claimed his voice wasn't born of injury or illness, it was a wound of the spirit that ran deeper than flesh. Samuel had been a preacher once, in a small church in Missouri, where he'd believed his words could heal hearts and guide souls toward salvation. He'd married his childhood sweetheart, Elizabeth, and they'd been blessed with a daughter, Sarah, whose laughter had filled their modest parsonage with joy. Samuel carried his father's Bible in his saddlebag, though he hadn't opened it since the night his world had collapsed. The leather cover was worn smooth from years of use, and the pages were filled with his father's careful annotations, a lifetime of faith, distilled into marginalia and underlined verses. It had been the most precious thing Samuel owned, once upon a time. The night he lost everything, Samuel had been away from home, called to a distant town to perform a wedding ceremony. The fire that claimed his church, his parsonage, and his family had started in the early hours of morning, a lantern knocked over by accident, according to the investigation. By the time Samuel returned, there was nothing left but ash and the kind of grief that devoured everything it touched. He'd stood in the ruins of his life, surrounded by well-meaning neighbors who offered condolences and platitudes about God's plan, and had felt his faith shatter like glass. The words that had once flowed from him, so easily words of comfort, hope, and divine love, had simply dried up, not just his voice, but his belief in the power of words themselves. For 3 days, Samuel had knelt in the ashes of his home, clutching his father's Bible and waiting for some sign, some voice from heaven that would explain why a loving God would allow such devastation. No voice had come, On the fourth day, he'd packed his few remaining possessions, saddled his horse, and ridden west without looking back. That had been 7 years ago. 7 years of wandering from town to town, finding work where he could, speaking to no one, because he no longer believed in the power of words to heal or comfort or change anything at all. He'd become a ghost of his former self, present but not truly living, helping others while remaining fundamentally alone. Thunder shifted in the corral, drawing Samuel back to the present moment. The stallion had moved closer to the fence, though he maintained a careful distance. In the moonlight, his scars were clearly visibly reminders of human cruelty, etched permanently into his magnificent hide. Samuel pulled his journal from his jacket and wrote by the light of the moon, "We are both marked by what we've survived." But perhaps survival itself is a kind of faith that tomorrow might be different than yesterday. The next morning brought an unexpected complication. Pete arrived at the livery stable to find Samuel already there, sitting on an overturned bucket beside Thunder's corral, with his journal open on his lap. The boy had been coming early every day since Samuel's arrival, eager to learn from the silent man who seemed to understand horses better than anyone Pete had ever met. "Mr. Samuel," Pete said quietly, using the formal address that felt right for someone who commanded such respect despite his silence. "What are we going to do about that Kane fellow?" Samuel looked up from his writing and studied the boy's earnest face. At 16, Pete had already experienced more loss than many men twice his age. His father's death had forced him to take on responsibilities that should have belonged to adults, and the struggle to keep his family's business afloat had aged him beyond his years. But there was still hope in his eyes, still a belief that good could triumph over evil if people were willing to fight for it. Samuel wrote in his journal and showed the page to Pete. "Sometimes the right thing to do isn't the legal thing, but there are consequences to every choice." Pete read the words twice, absorbing their weight. "You mean we might get in trouble for protecting Thunder?" Samuel nodded, then wrote again. "Kane has legal ownership. Fighting that means fighting the law itself. But that don't make it right." Pete protested. "Just because something's legal don't mean it's moral. My pa used to say that sometimes a man's got to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." The boy's words struck something deep in Samuel's chest, an echo of the man he used to be, the preacher who'd believed that righteousness should guide every decision. Samuel had spent 7 years running from that responsibility, hiding behind his silence as an excuse not to take stands or make difficult choices. He looked at Thunder, who was watching their conversation with intelligent eyes. The stallion had grown noticeably calmer since Samuel's arrival in town, no longer pacing constantly or striking out at anyone who approached the corral. Yesterday, Thunder had even allowed Pete to stand near the fence without displaying aggressive behavior, a small miracle that spoke to the healing power of patience and kindness. Samuel made a decision that surprised even himself. He stood up, tucked his journal away, and walked to the corral gate. Pete watched in amazement as Samuel lifted the latch and stepped into the enclosure with Thunder. The stallion tensed immediately, his ears flattening against his skull and his muscles bunching as if preparing to charge. But Samuel didn't approach instead. He simply stood near the gate, making himself present without being threatening. He pulled the carved wooden horse from his pocket, the one he'd been working on the previous evening, and held it in his open palm. Minutes passed in tense silence. Thunder snorted and pawed the ground, clearly agitated by having a human in his space, but not yet moved to violence. Samuel remained perfectly still, radiating the kind of calm patience that spoke of infinite time and infinite understanding. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Thunder's ears began to relax, his head lowered slightly, and the rigid tension in his muscles began to ease. He was still wary, still ready to explode into defensive action, but something in Samuel's quiet presence was reaching past his fear to touch the part of him that remembered what it felt like to trust. Pete held his breath as Samuel took a single, careful step forward. Thunder's response was immediate. He reared up on his hind legs, hooves flashing in the morning sunlight. But instead of charging, the stallion came down in the same spot, his action more warning than attack. Samuel acknowledged the warning by taking a step backward, showing Thunder that he respected the horse's boundaries. Then he did something that made Pete's eyes widen with wonder. He knelt down in the dust of the corral and placed the wooden horse on the ground between them. The carved figure was beautiful in its simplicity, capturing the essence of equine grace in smooth, flowing lines. Samuel had spent hours the previous evening working on it, his hands finding peace in the familiar motions of creation. Now he offered it as a gift, a token of respect from one survivor to another. Thunder stared at the wooden horse for a long moment, then at Samuel's kneeling form. The stallion's nostrils flared as he tried to read the sense and intentions of this strange human, who showed no fear, carried no weapons, and made no demands. Gradually, curiosity began to overcome caution. Step by cautious step, Thunder approached the carved horse. He stretched his neck forward, sniffing delicately at the wooden figure, while keeping his body positioned for a quick escape. When he was satisfied that the object posed no threat, he lowered his great head until his muzzle was only inches from Samuel's hands. For a moment that felt eternal, horse and man regarded each other at eye level. Samuel could see his own reflection in Thunder's dark eyes, could read the pain and wariness that mirrored his own emotional scars. Without thinking, he reached up slowly and touched the stallion's muzzle with the backs of his fingers. Thunder didn't pull away. The contact lasted only seconds before the horse stepped back, but it was enough. Pete let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, and even Thunder seemed surprised by his own tolerance for human touch. Samuel rose slowly and backed toward the gate, leaving the wooden horse where Thunder could examine it further. As he exited the corral, he saw Mary approaching from the saloon, her expression mixing admiration with concern. "That was either very brave or very foolish," she said softly. Samuel pulled out his journal and wrote, "Sometimes they're the same thing." Mary read the words and smiled, despite the gravity of their situation. "Kane will be back this morning with the sheriff. Even if we wanted to fight his claim, we don't have legal grounds." Samuel nodded, understanding the impossible position they were in. Kane held all the legal cards, backed by ownership papers that would satisfy any court. Fighting him would mean breaking the law, and Samuel had seen enough violence in his lifetime to know that such conflicts rarely ended well for anyone involved. But as he looked at Thunder, who was now sniffing curiously at the wooden horse, Samuel felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced in 7 years. It wasn't faith, exactly, but it was something close to it, the belief that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the consequences. Pete appeared at his elbow, the boy's face set with determination beyond his years. "We can't let Kane take him, Mr. Samuel. That man will kill Thunder's spirit if he ain't killed it already." Samuel looked at the boy, then at Mary, then at Thunder. 3 lives that had somehow become intertwined with his own. 3 souls who were counting on him to find a solution that his silence had made seemingly impossible. In his journal he wrote, "Sometimes the greatest act of faith is believing that the right path will reveal itself, even when we can't see it yet." As if summoned by his thoughts, Thunder approached the fence where they stood. The stallion's eyes were calmer now, holding a spark of something that hadn't been there before. Not trust exactly, but the possibility of trust. He stretched his neck toward Samuel, not quite close enough to touch, but closer than he'd allowed anyone except Samuel to come. The wooden horse lay forgotten in the dust of the corral, but its message had been received. Between a mute cowboy and a damaged stallion, a language of understanding was beginning to form that needed no words and recognized no legal ownership except that forged by compassion and mutual respect. Samuel's breakthrough with Thunder had drawn a small crowd by mid-morning, word spreading through Cedar Ridge with the speed that news traveled in small towns. Ezra had closed his smithy early to watch, his massive frame leaning against the corral fence as Samuel continued his patient work with the stallion. Mary brought coffee and stayed, and even Doc Harrison, the town's elderly physician, had wandered over to witness what he called the most interesting case of interspecies communication he'd seen in 40 years of practice. But the audience made Samuel uncomfortable. He'd grown used to working in solitude, finding peace in tasks that required no interaction with others. The weight of their expectations felt heavier than his silence, and he could see that Thunder was equally disturbed by the attention. The stallion's earlier calm was beginning to fracture under the pressure of so many watching eyes. Samuel wrote a quick note and handed it to Mary. "Too many people. He needs quiet." Mary understood immediately and began diplomatically encouraging the spectators to give them space. "Folks, let's let them work in peace. Samuel knows what he's doing." As the crowd dispersed, Thunder's posture relaxed visibly. The stallion had positioned himself near the wooden horse Samuel had carved, using it as a kind of anchor point. Whenever his anxiety spiked, Thunder would lower his head to sniff the carving, as if drawing comfort from this small token of understanding. Samuel settled onto his overturned bucket and opened his journal to a page he'd written the night before. The words came from a place deeper than conscious thought, flowing from the part of him that still believed in redemption, despite everything he'd lost. Pain recognizes pain across all boundaries of species and circumstance. In Thunder's eyes, I see the reflection of my own wounds, the scars that don't show on the surface but run deeper than flesh. We are both creatures who have learned that survival sometimes means building walls so high that even kindness cannot scale them. As he read his own words, Samuel felt the familiar ache that came with remembering. His hand moved unconsciously to his saddlebag, where a photograph lay hidden beneath his spare clothes and meager possessions. He hadn't looked at it in months, but its presence was a constant weight that traveled with him everywhere. The photograph had been taken 2 months before the fire, at a church social where the whole community had gathered to celebrate the harvest. Elizabeth sat in a chair with 3-year-old Sarah on her lap, both of them laughing at something Samuel's father had said just before the camera clicked. Samuel stood behind them, his hand resting on Elizabeth's shoulder, his face showing the kind of contentment that came from believing the future held nothing but blessings. He'd been a different man, then confident in his faith, certain that his words could heal and his prayers could protect those he loved. The Samuel in that photograph believed that righteousness was rewarded and that good men who served God faithfully would see their families prosper. That Samuel had never imagined that devotion could be met with devastation, that a life built on service to others could crumble in the space of a single night. Pete noticed Samuel's distant expression and approached carefully. The boy had developed an instinct for reading his mentor's moods, understanding when to offer companionship and when to provide solitude. "You thinking about before?" Pete asked softly. Samuel looked up, surprised by the boy's perceptiveness. He wrote in his journal, "We all have a before a time when the world made sense." Pete read the words and nodded with wisdom beyond his years. "My pa used to say that life breaks everybody, but some folks get stronger in the broken places." The quote stirred something in Samuel's memory, a fragment of scripture he'd once used in sermons about redemption and renewal. But where those words had once brought comfort, now they only highlighted the distance between who he'd been and who he'd become. Thunder approached the fence then, drawn by the quiet conversation. The stallion's movements were more relaxed than they'd been since his arrival in town, though his ears still swiveled constantly, alert for any sign of danger. He stretched his neck towards Samuel, not quite close enough for contact, but closer than he'd allowed anyone else to approach. "He's getting better," Pete observed. "Less afraid." Samuel studied Thunder's posture and recognized the subtle signs of a creature learning to hope again despite past trauma. The stallion's scars told a story of systematic cruelty, not the random violence of a predator, but the calculated brutality of humans who had used pain as a training method. Yet here Thunder stood, still magnificent despite his wounds, still capable of curiosity and trust. Mary joined them at the fence, carrying a fresh pot of coffee and wearing the worried expression that had become her default since Kane's visit the previous day. "Sheriff Williams should be here within the hour," she said quietly. "Kane rode out early this morning to fetch him." Samuel felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with impending confrontation. For 7 years, he'd avoided situations that might require him to take a stand, to speak truth to power, to risk himself for others. His silence had become both shield and prison, protecting him from further loss while isolating him from meaningful connection. But Thunder represented something different, a chance to act without words, to make a difference through deed rather than declaration. The Stallion had shown him that communication didn't require speech, that understanding could flow between souls without the mediation of language. Samuel reached into his saddlebag and withdrew the photograph, handling it with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. Elizabeth's face smiled up at him across the years, and Sarah's laugh seemed to echo in the space between memory and regret. For the first time since their deaths, Samuel felt their presence not as accusation, but as encouragement, a reminder that love once given was never truly lost. Pete glimpsed the photograph, and his eyes widened. "Your family?" Samuel nodded, unable to write while his hands shook with the emotion of sharing this most private grief. "They're beautiful," Pete said simply. "What happened to them?" Samuel took several minutes to compose himself before writing, "Fire. 7 years ago. I was away, performing a wedding in another town. Came home to find everything gone." Pete read the words and felt his own heart break a little. He'd lost his father to disease, but he couldn't imagine the devastation of losing everyone at once. "That's why you don't talk." Samuel wrote carefully, "Lost my faith in words, in everything really. If God could take them while I was serving him, what good were all my prayers and sermons?" Mary had been reading over Pete's shoulder, and tears glistened in her eyes. She'd suspected that Samuel carried deep wounds, but knowing the details made his daily acts of kindness even more remarkable. Here was a man who had every reason to turn his back on humanity, yet he chose instead to help others heal from their own trauma. "Maybe," Mary said gently, "you weren't meant to save them with words. Maybe you were meant to save others with actions." Samuel looked at her, then at Thunder, then at the photograph in his hands. The Stallion was watching him with intelligent eyes, as if somehow understanding that this moment was important, that decisions were being weighed that would affect them all. Sheriff Williams arrived precisely at noon, riding alongside Kane and looking distinctly uncomfortable with his assignment. Tom Williams was a fair man who'd kept the peace in Cedar Ridge for 15 years, but he was also a man who followed the law even when it didn't align with his personal feelings. Kane's ownership papers were legally sound, which meant the sheriff had no choice but to enforce them. "Samuel," Sheriff Williams said, dismounting and approaching the corral, "I hear you've been working with this horse. That's good, shows he can be gentle, but I'm afraid Mr. Kane has rightful claim to the animal." Samuel stood and faced the sheriff, his journal clutched in his hands. He wrote quickly, "That man has tortured this horse. Look at the scars." Sheriff Williams read the note and sighed. "I can see the horse has been mistreated, Samuel, but that don't change the legal facts. Kane's got bills of sale and breeding papers that check out. My hands are tied." Kane smirked from his position near the fence. "Told you the law was on my side. Now step away from my property so I can collect what's mine." Thunder sensed the tension immediately and began pacing again, his earlier calm evaporating as Kane's presence brought back memories of pain and fear. The Stallion's distress was visible to everyone, present the way his ears flattened against his skull, how his muscles bunched with nervous energy, the way he kept as far from Kane as the corral would allow. Samuel made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He walked to the corral gate and stepped inside with Thunder, positioning himself between the Stallion and Kane. His message was clear. If Kane wanted the horse, he'd have to go through Samuel first. "Now, Samuel," Sheriff Williams said, his voice carrying a warning, "don't make this harder than it needs to be. I don't want to arrest you, but I will if you interfere with legal proceedings." Samuel pulled out his journal and wrote with steady hands, "Some things are worth the consequences." Pete read the words aloud, his young voice carrying clearly in the tense air. The simple statement seemed to crystallize everything Samuel had learned about courage in the past 24 hours, that real bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act righteously despite it. Kane's patience was wearing thin, "Sheriff, I've got a legal right to my property. Are you going to enforce the law or not?" Before Sheriff Williams could respond, Thunder made a choice of his own. The stallion approached Samuel, and for the first time since his arrival in Cedar Ridge, deliberately placed his head against a human's shoulder. The gesture was unmistakable trust, acceptance, and perhaps even love flowing between two damaged souls who had found healing in each other's presence. The crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation fell silent at the sight. Even Cain seemed momentarily taken aback by the obvious bond between horse and man. Here was proof that Thunder was capable of gentleness, that his violent reputation was born of mistreatment rather than inherent viciousness. Samuel rested his hand on Thunder's neck, feeling the stallion's steady heartbeat through his palm. In that moment, he understood that this wasn't just about saving a horse, it was about reclaiming his own ability to stand for something greater than himself. The silence that had protected him for 7 years had also diminished him, turning him into a passive observer of life rather than an active participant. He looked at the photograph, still clutched in his other hand, at Elizabeth's face and Sarah's laugh, and felt their love reach across time to strengthen his resolve. They wouldn't want him to live in perpetual grief. They would want him to find purpose again, to use his pain to prevent others from suffering. Samuel tucked the photograph safely away and wrote one final message in his journal. He tore out the page and handed it to Sheriff Williams, who read it aloud for everyone to hear. "I may not be able to speak, but I can still choose to stand between cruelty and innocence. If taking that stand means breaking an unjust law, then I will accept whatever consequences come." The words hung in the air like a challenge to every person present to examine their own moral courage. Samuel had thrown down a gauntlet that would force them all to choose between legal convenience and ethical obligation. Cain's face darkened with anger. "Sheriff, arrest this man for interfering with my rightful property. I want him in jail and my horse loaded for transport within the hour." But Sheriff Williams was staring at Samuel with newfound respect, recognizing the kind of quiet heroism that shaped legends. The sheriff found himself at a crossroads of his own, forced to choose between the letter of the law and the spirit of justice that had drawn him to law enforcement in the first place. The standoff in Thunder's corral stretched on for nearly an hour, with Samuel refusing to leave the stallion's side and Cain growing increasingly agitated. Sheriff Williams found himself in the uncomfortable position of mediating between legal obligation and moral instinct, while a growing crowd of townspeople gathered to witness what was becoming Cedar Ridge's most significant confrontation in years. Thunder remained calm as long as Samuel stood near him, but the stallion's agitation returned whenever Cain spoke or moved closer to the corral. The horse's behavior was so markedly different between the two men that even the most skeptical observers couldn't deny the obvious Thunder trusted Samuel and feared Cain with an intensity that spoke of deep trauma. Mary watched the proceedings from the saloon's porch, her heart torn between admiration for Samuel's courage and fear for his safety. She'd seen enough of life to know that legal disputes rarely favored the righteous over the well-connected, and Cain struck her as the type of man who wouldn't hesitate to use violence if the law failed to give him what he wanted. Young Pete stood at the corral fence, his fists clenched with the helpless anger of someone too young to effect change but old enough to recognize injustice. The boy had become deeply attached to both Samuel and Thunder over the past weeks, and the thought of losing them both to Cain's cruelty was almost unbearable. Ezra Blackwood arrived from his smithy still wearing his leather apron, the massive blacksmith's presence adding weight to the gathering crowd. Ezra was respected throughout the territory for his skill and his character, and his opinion carried influence with Sheriff Williams. "Tom," Ezra said to the sheriff, his deep voice cutting through the tension, "I've known you for 15 years, and I've never seen you enforce a law that went against your conscience. Don't start now." Sheriff Williams removed his hat and ran his fingers through his graying hair. "Ezra, you know I respect your opinion, but the law is the law. Cain's got papers that prove ownership. I can't just ignore that because we don't like the man. Sometimes the law ain't right, Pete said suddenly, his young voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. My pa taught me that there's a difference between what's legal and what's just. Kane wheeled on the boy, his pale eyes flashing with anger. You'd better teach that boy to respect his betters, or someone else will teach him for you. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, and Samuel felt something shift inside his chest, a protective fury that he hadn't experienced since the night he'd stood in the ashes of his home. His hand moved instinctively toward the knife at his belt, not with aggressive intent, but with the readiness of someone prepared to defend the innocent. It was then that the town's telegraph operator, a nervous man named Harold Finch, came running across the street with a yellow paper clutched in his hands. Sheriff Williams, got an urgent wire for you. Sheriff Williams took the telegram and read it quickly, his expression changing as he absorbed the information. He read it again, more slowly, then looked up at Kane with newfound suspicion. Well now, the sheriff said, folding the telegram carefully. This is interesting. Got a wire here from the Texas Rangers. Seems they've been looking for a man matching your description, Mr. Kane. Something about stolen horses and a missing rancher named Brennan. Kane's face went pale, but he quickly recovered his composure. Don't know what you're talking about, Sheriff. My papers are all in order. Maybe so, Sheriff Williams replied, his tone now carrying the authority of someone back on familiar ground. But this telegram suggests that the Brennan Ranch was robbed 3 months ago. Owner was found dead, and several valuable horses were taken. The description of one of those horses matches your stallion here pretty closely. The crowd murmured with excitement as the implications became clear. If Kane had indeed stolen Thunder, then his ownership papers were worthless, and his presence in Cedar Ridge took on a much more sinister character. Samuel felt Thunder relax beside him, as the stallion seemed to sense that the tide was turning. The horse's ears perked forward with curiosity rather than fear, and he moved closer to Samuel, as if seeking reassurance that this new development was indeed hopeful. Kane's hand dropped to his gun belt, and the gesture wasn't lost on Sheriff Williams, who was an experienced lawman despite his generally peaceful nature. Now, Mr. Kane, let's not do anything hasty. I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding that can be cleared up with a few more telegrams. There's no misunderstanding, Kane said, his voice tight with controlled rage. That horse belongs to me, and I'll not be cheated out of what's mine by small-town gossip and forged telegrams. Mary stepped forward from the crowd, her green eyes flashing with indignation. Are you suggesting that our sheriff would forge a telegram? That's a serious accusation, Mr. Kane. Kane's gaze fixed on Mary with the kind of attention that made Samuel's protective instincts flare even higher. Pretty lady, you'd be wise to stay out of matters that don't concern you. Men's business has a way of getting complicated when women interfere. The threat was implicit but unmistakable, and it had the effect of galvanizing the entire crowd against Kane. Even the most law-abiding citizens of Cedar Ridge weren't about to tolerate threats against Mary, who was beloved by virtually everyone in town. Samuel stepped to the edge of the corral, his journal already open to a page he'd prepared. He showed it to Sheriff Williams, who read aloud, "Send another telegram. Ask about John Brennan's horses. Ask about the black stallion with scars. Ask about Kane's real name." Sheriff Williams nodded slowly. "Good thinking, Samuel. Harold, get back to that telegraph and send a detailed inquiry to the Texas Rangers. I want to know everything they have on this situation." Harold Finch scurried away to his telegraph office, leaving Kane facing a growing wall of suspicion and legal scrutiny. The man's confident demeanor was beginning to crack under the pressure, and those pale eyes now held a desperate quality that made everyone present step back slightly. "You people have no idea what you're dealing with," Kane said, his voice carrying a new edge of violence. "I've killed men for less than what you're putting me through." The admission sent a chill through the crowd, but it also had the effect of removing any remaining doubt about Kane's character. This was clearly a dangerous man who had come to their town under false pretenses, carrying forged papers and making threats against their citizens. Samuel felt thunder press closer against him, the stallion seeking comfort from the one human he'd learned to trust. The horse's behavior spoke louder than any words could hear, was an animal who had been systematically brutalized by Cain, who had learned to associate the man's presence with pain and fear. Pete had been quiet during the exchange, but now he stepped forward with the kind of courage that comes from righteous anger. "Mr. Cain, I think you should leave our town. Right now, before the sheriff gets more information that you probably don't want him to have." Cain turned his cold gaze on the boy, and for a moment the assembled crowd held its collective breath. The man's hand still rested on his gun, and his entire posture suggested someone balanced on the edge of violence. "Boy," Cain said slowly, "you got more mouth than sense. Maybe it's time someone taught you when to keep quiet." Samuel had heard enough. He opened the corral gate and stepped out, positioning himself between Cain and Pete with a deliberate movement that spoke of protecting family. His journal was already open to a page where he'd written a single word: no. The simplicity of the message was more powerful than any lengthy speech could have been. Samuel stood there, silent but immovable, his body language conveying that any threat to Pete would have to go through him first. Mary joined them, moving to stand beside Samuel in a show of solidarity that wasn't lost on anyone present. "Mr. Cain, I think you'll find that the people of Cedar Ridge look after their own." Ezra stepped forward as well, his massive frame casting a shadow over Cain. "Might be best if you waited for those telegrams somewhere else. The Silver Dollar in the next town over has rooms for rent." One by one, the other townspeople began moving closer, creating a wall of human solidarity that transformed the confrontation from a legal dispute into a moral referendum. Cain found himself facing not just Samuel and Sheriff Williams, but an entire community that had chosen to stand together against injustice. Thunder seemed to sense the shift in dynamics and let out a sound that was part whinny, part challenge the voice of a creature who had learned that sometimes others would fight on his behalf, that he wasn't alone in his suffering. Cain's eyes swept the crowd, calculating odds and assessing threats. He was clearly a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and legal manipulation, but he was also intelligent enough to recognize when a situation had moved beyond his control. "This isn't over," he said finally, backing toward his horse. "I'll be back with proper authority and enough men to settle this matter permanently." As Cain mounted and rode out of town, Samuel felt Thunder relax completely for the first time since the stallion's arrival. The horse lowered his head and breathed out slowly, as if releasing weeks of accumulated tension. Sheriff Williams approached Samuel and spoke quietly. "You did a brave thing here today, Samuel. Win or lose, you stood up for what was right." Samuel wrote in his journal, "Sometimes standing up is all we can do, but it's enough." Pete read the words and felt something shift in his understanding of what it meant to be a man. He'd witnessed courage today, not the flashy bravery of gunfighters and heroes, but the quiet determination of ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things. As the crowd began to disperse, Mary lingered beside Samuel at the corral fence. Thunder approached them both, no longer the terrified, aggressive animal who had arrived weeks earlier, but a creature beginning to remember what it felt like to trust. "What happens now?" Mary asked. Samuel wrote, "We wait for the truth, and we hope it's enough." In the distance, Harold Finch could be seen hunched over his telegraph key, sending urgent messages that would determine not just Thunder's fate, but Samuel's as well. The next few hours would reveal whether justice could triumph over legal technicalities, whether a community's moral courage could overcome one man's documented claim to ownership. But for now, in the quiet afternoon light of Cedar Ridge, a mute cowboy and a healing horse stood together in peaceful understanding, surrounded by people who had chosen to believe that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. The telegram replies began arriving within 2 hours, each message adding another layer to the picture of Silas Cain's true nature. Harold Finch ran back and forth between his telegraph office and the sheriff's station, his face growing more grave with each yellow slip of paper he delivered. Sheriff Williams read the telegrams aloud to the assembled group in his office. Samuel, Mary, Pete, and Ezra had become an unofficial council of war, united by their shared determination to protect Thunder and see justice done. First one's from the Texas Rangers headquarters in Austin, Sheriff Williams began. Says here that John Brennan was found dead on his ranch 3 months ago, shot twice in the back. Several valuable horses were missing, including a black stallion with distinctive scarring patterns. The lead suspect is a man calling himself Silas Kane, real name suspected to be Silas Cordwainer, wanted for horse theft and murder across 3 states. Pete let out a low whistle. So Kane's not just a horse thief, he's a killer. Gets worse, Sheriff Williams continued, reading from the second telegram. This one's from the sheriff in Millerville, Texas. Says Cordwainer was seen there 2 months ago, gambling in the local saloon, caught using loaded dice but escaped before they could arrest him. Left behind a bag of personal effects that included bills of sale for horses matching Brennan's stolen stock. Samuel wrote in his journal, "The papers he showed us, they're for stolen horses." Mary shuddered. To think that man was standing right here in our town, threatening us all. Ezra's massive hands clenched into fists. Should have known something was wrong when that horse reacted to him the way he did. Animals got better instincts about people than most folks do. The third telegram provided the final piece of the puzzle. Sheriff Williams's voice grew grim as he read, "This one's from Fort Worth. Silas Cordwainer, suspected in deaths of at least 6 men across Texas and Oklahoma, uses various aliases, including Silas Kane, known to carry loaded dice as good luck charm, considered extremely dangerous. Approach with caution and request assistance if located." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Kane wasn't just a cruel horse owner or even a simple thief. He was a multiple murderer who had come to their peaceful town carrying forged papers and making claims on property stolen from a dead man. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine as he remembered Kane's threats against Pete and Mary. The man's casual references to violence hadn't been idle boasting. They had been the words of someone with extensive experience in killing. Pete broke the silence with a question that had been haunting all of them. "You think he'll come back?" Sheriff Williams folded the telegrams and tucked them into his desk drawer. Man like that doesn't give up easy, especially when he thinks he's got a legal claim to valuable property. He'll be back probably with hired guns. "How long do we have?" Mary asked. "Hard to say. Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on how much he wants that horse and how much help he can rustle up." Samuel wrote, "Thunder isn't just valuable, he's evidence. If the Rangers get him, they can prove Kane stole Brennan's horses." Sheriff Williams nodded grimly. "Exactly. That horse is the key to hanging Cordwainer for murder. He can't afford to let us keep Thunder, and he can't afford to let the Rangers get their hands on him either." The realization that they were all now in mortal danger settled over the group like a shroud. They had stumbled into something much larger and more dangerous than a simple dispute over horse ownership. They were now the only thing standing between a multiple murderer and his freedom. Over the following days, life in Cedar Ridge took on a tense, watchful quality. Sheriff Williams sent for additional help from the territorial marshal, but response times in the frontier were measured in weeks rather than days. The town would have to protect itself until official reinforcements arrived. Samuel found himself spending every waking moment with Thunder, partly to continue the Stallion's healing process, but mostly because he couldn't bear the thought of Kane returning to reclaim his property. The bond between man and horse had deepened beyond anything Samuel had thought possible, transcending the boundaries of species to become something approaching spiritual communion. Thunder had begun responding to Samuel's presence with obvious joy, nickering softly when he saw him approaching and following him around the corral like a massive, scarred shadow. The stallion would rest his head on Samuel's shoulder while Samuel wrote in his journal, and the two would stand together in comfortable silence that needed no words to bridge. Pete had become Samuel's constant companion as well, the boy's natural curiosity and eagerness to learn making him an ideal student for Samuel's patient teaching methods. Through gestures, demonstrations, and carefully written notes, Samuel taught Pete to read the subtle signs of equine behavior, how a horse's ears communicated mood, how their posture revealed comfort or anxiety, how trust could be built through consistency and respect rather than dominance and fear. It's like learning a whole new language. Pete confided to Mary one evening as they watched Samuel work with Thunder. Mr. Samuel don't need words to talk to horses. He speaks their language better than most people speak English. Mary had been observing Samuel's work with professional interest, recognizing in his patient methods something that reminded her of her own approach to managing difficult customers in the saloon. Both required the ability to read unspoken communication, to sense when someone was ready for approach and when they needed space. She'd also been watching Samuel himself, noting how his work with Thunder seemed to be healing something deep inside him. The haunted quality in his eyes was gradually being replaced by something that looked almost like peace. Whatever tragedy had stolen his voice was slowly losing its hold over his spirit. One evening, as Samuel sat beside Thunder's corral writing in his journal by lamplight, Mary approached with 2 cups of coffee and settled beside him on the wooden bench Ezra had built specifically for these vigils. "Penny, for your thoughts," she said softly, offering him one of the cups. Samuel accepted the coffee gratefully and wrote, "Thinking about second chances, how sometimes God gives us opportunities to heal old wounds by healing new ones." Mary read the words and felt her heart catch. In the weeks since Samuel's arrival, she'd come to admire not just his skill with horses, but his gentle nature and quiet strength. She'd found herself looking forward to their wordless conversations, to the way he listened with complete attention, even when she was just chatting about everyday concerns. "Do you think that's what Thunder is for you?" she asked. "A second chance?" Samuel considered the question seriously before writing, "Maybe we're second chances for each other. He teaches me that trust is possible even after betrayal. I show him that not all humans are cruel." "And what about us?" Mary asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The people who care about you, are we part of your second chance too?" Samuel looked at her in the lamplight, seeing the hope and vulnerability in her green eyes. For 7 years, he'd kept himself isolated from human connection, believing that caring for others would only lead to more loss. But Thunder had shown him that healing was possible, that scars didn't have to define a creature's entire existence. He wrote carefully, "I spent 7 years believing that loving people only led to losing them. But maybe the real tragedy would be never loving anyone again." Mary felt tears spring to her eyes as she read the words. She reached out tentatively and placed her hand over his, and when he didn't pull away, she felt something shift between thema possibility for connection that went beyond their shared concern for Thunder. Thunder seemed to sense the change in atmosphere and approached the fence where they sat. The stallion had grown comfortable enough with Mary's presence to allow her to stand near Samuel, recognizing her as part of his expanding circle of trust. Pete arrived then, carrying a lantern and wearing the serious expression that had become his default since Cain's threats. The boy had taken it upon himself to serve as a lookout during the evening hours, positioned where he could watch the roads leading into town. "No sign of Cain yet," Pete reported, settling onto the ground beside the bench. "But I've been thinking about what Sheriff Williams said about Cain coming back with help." Samuel wrote, "What kind of thinking?" "Well, if Cain's got money from selling stolen horses, he could hire men to help him, gunfighters and such. We got Sheriff Williams and maybe a few townspeople who can handle themselves, but we ain't exactly an army." The sobering reality of their situation settled over them again. Cain had proven himself to be both intelligent and ruthless, and he would likely return with enough firepower to overwhelm any resistance Cedar Ridge could mount. Mary voiced what they were all thinking. "Maybe we should just let the Rangers handle this, send Thunder to them for safekeeping and get him out of harm's way." Samuel considered the suggestion seriously. It would certainly be the safest course of action for everyone involved. Thunder would be protected, the town would be spared a potentially violent confrontation, and Cain would be denied his prize. But as he looked at Thunder standing peacefully in the moonlight, his scars no longer symbols of trauma, but badges of survival, Samuel realized that sending the horse away would be another form of abandonment. Thunder had learned to trust again, had found a place where he felt safe. To tear him away from that security, even for his own protection, felt like a betrayal of everything they'd built together. Samuel wrote, "Thunder has been moved around, sold, stolen, and abused his whole life. Maybe it's time he had a place to call home." Pete read the words and nodded firmly. "That's right. This is his home now, and we're his family. We don't abandon family just because things get dangerous." Mary squeezed Samuel's hand. "Then we make our stand here, together." As if understanding the gravity of their commitment, Thunder stepped closer to the fence and rested his great head near Samuel's shoulder. The stallion's breathing was slow and steady, the rhythm of a creature at peace despite the storms gathering on the horizon. Samuel reached up and stroked Thunder's neck, feeling the trust that flowed between them like a current of healing energy. Whatever came next, they would face it together, a mute cowboy, a damaged horse, and the people who had chosen to believe that some bonds were worth defending with their lives. In the distance, a coyote howled at the moon, its voice carrying across the empty plains, with a sound that spoke of wildness and freedom. Thunder's ears perked at the sound, but he didn't move away from Samuel's touch. He had found his pack, his herd, his family, and no amount of danger would make him willing to give that up again. The loaded dice in Kane's pocket might give him an advantage in games of chance, but he had miscalculated the odds when he'd threatened the people of Cedar Ridge. Some things couldn't be won through cheating or intimidation. Some battles had to be fought with honor, courage, and the kind of love that transforms broken souls into whole ones. As the night deepened around them, Samuel, Mary, Pete, and Thunder settled into the peaceful vigilance of those who knew that trouble was coming, but refused to let fear steal their present moments of joy. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight belonged to Thema family, forged not by blood but by choice, strengthened not by easy circumstances but by shared commitment to protecting what mattered most. The discovery came by accident, as the most profound revelations often do. Samuel had been grooming Thunder in the early morning light, working carefully through the stallion's thick mane with a borrowed brush, when his fingers encountered something unexpected beneath the coarse hair near the horse's left shoulder. At first, Samuel thought it might be another scar. Thunder's body bore so many marks of past cruelty that finding new ones had become routine. But as he parted the mane to get a better look, his breath caught in his throat. There, hidden beneath layers of hair and partially obscured by an old rope burn, was a brand mark that made Samuel's world tilt on its axis. The brand was faded and deliberately scarred over, but the basic shape was still discernible, a simple C enclosed in a circle. Samuel's hands began to shake as recognition flooded through him, bringing with it a wave of memories so powerful they nearly brought him to his knees. That brand belonged to the Cartwright family ranch in Missouri, ranch where Samuel had grown up, where his father had preached at the local church, where his brother Daniel had worked with horses until the war had claimed him along with so many other young men. Daniel, Samuel's younger brother by 3 years, the one who'd inherited their father's gift with horses while Samuel had been called to the ministry. Daniel, who'd enlisted in the Union cavalry at 18 with dreams of glory and adventure. Daniel, who'd never come home from the Battle of Gettysburg, whose body had never been found among the thousands of casualties scattered across that blood-soaked Pennsylvania field. Samuel sank to his knees beside Thunder, his journal forgotten as the implications crashed over him like a tidal wave. This horse, this magnificent, scarred stallion, who'd found his way to Cedar Ridge through a chain of theft and violence, was Daniel's horse. The last living connection to Samuel's lost brother. Thunder sensed Samuel's distress immediately and lowered his great head to nuzzle Samuel's shoulder, offering the kind of comfort that transcended species. The gesture was so gentle, so understanding, that Samuel felt his eyes fill with tears for the first time in 7 years. "Daniel," Samuel whispered, the word escaping his lips before he could stop it, the first sound he'd made in longer than anyone in Cedar Ridge had known him. The name felt foreign on his tongue after so many years of silence, but it also felt like coming home. Thunder's ears pricked forward at the sound of Samuel's voice, as if the stallion somehow understood the significance of this moment. The horse had been responding to Samuel's silent communication for weeks, but this single whispered word seemed to forge an even deeper connection between them. Pete arrived for his morning chores to find Samuel still kneeling beside Thunder, staring at something in the horse's mane, with an expression of wonder and grief combined. The boy approached cautiously, recognizing that he was witnessing something profound and private. "Mr. Samuel, you all right?" Samuel looked up at Pete with eyes that were both devastated and enlightened. He pointed to the hidden brand and managed to speak again, his voice rusty from disuse. This was my brother's horse." Pete's eyes widened as he processed the revelation. "Your brother? But how, where?" Samuel pulled his journal close and wrote with trembling hands. "Daniel enlisted in the cavalry, never came home from the war. They said his body was never found, along with his horse. This is him, this is Midnight." The name came back to Samuel, as if summoned from the depths of memory. Midnight, the black colt Daniel had gentled as a teenager, the horse he'd trained with such patience and love that the animal had become more companion than livestock. Daniel had written letters home about Midnight, describing their adventures and the bond they'd formed during the long months of war. Pete read Samuel's words and felt his own eyes fill with tears. The story was taking on dimensions that none of them had imagined. This wasn't just about saving a horse from cruelty, but about reuniting two brothers separated by death and time. "But if this is your brother's horse," Pete said slowly, "and Cain has been calling him Thunder, what happened to your brother?" Samuel's face darkened as he considered the question. If Midnight was here, bearing Cain's forged ownership papers, then something terrible had happened to Daniel. The horse couldn't have simply wandered away from the battlefield. Someone had taken him, and that someone might well have been Cain or one of his associates. Mary arrived then, drawn by the unusual sight of Samuel, and Pete huddled together in intense conversation. She could see immediately that something momentous had occurred. Samuel's entire posture spoke of a man who'd received earth-shaking news. "What's happened?" she asked softly. Samuel showed her his journal entry about the brand and about Daniel. Mary read the words twice, absorbing their significance, then looked at Thunder with new understanding. "So Cain didn't just steal any horse," she said. "He stole your brother's horse, and if your brother never came home from the war..." Samuel nodded grimly. The implication was clear Cain or his associates had likely encountered Daniel on or near the battlefield, had killed him for his horse, and had been passing Midnight off as stolen property ever since. The ownership papers Cain carried weren't just forged documents. They were evidence of murder disguised as legitimate transactions. Thunder Midnight seemed to sense the gravity of the conversation swirling around him. The stallion moved closer to Samuel, pressing his muzzle against Samuel's chest in a gesture that spoke of recognition that went beyond learned behavior. Perhaps some part of the horse remembered Daniel's scent on Samuel's clothes, some genetic similarity that marked them as family. Samuel reached up and scratched behind Midnight's ears, in exactly the spot Daniel had described in his letters as the horse's favorite. Midnight's response was immediate and unmistakable. He leaned into the touch with obvious pleasure, his eyes half closing in contentment. This was a gesture learned years ago, a specific form of affection that Daniel had taught his beloved horse. "He remembers," Samuel whispered, his voice growing stronger with each word. "He remembers Daniel." The revelation brought both comfort and anguish. Samuel finally knew what had happened to his brother. Daniel had died in service to his country, probably defending Midnight from thieves who saw only the horse's value rather than the bond between soldier and mount. But Daniel's death had been meaningless, his sacrifice reduced to a business transaction by men who trafficked in stolen lives. Pete broke the emotional silence with a practical question. "What do we do now?" Kane's gonna come back for him, and if he's been carrying forged papers all this time. Samuel stood slowly, his hand still resting on Midnight's neck. When he spoke, his voice carried a new quality, not just sound, but purpose. "Kane killed my brother," Samuel said, each word deliberate and weighted with years of suppressed grief. "He stole Daniel's horse and forged papers to sell him. He's been profiting from my brother's murder for years." Mary felt a chill run down her spine at the cold fury in Samuel's voice. She'd witnessed his transformation from silence to speech, but this was something more, the awakening of a man who'd found a cause worth fighting for. "The Rangers need to know about this," she said, "if we can prove that Kane murdered your brother." "How?" Pete interrupted. "Mr. Samuel's word against Kane's? We got no proof that his brother ever owned this horse except for a brand that could mean anything." Samuel reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small leather pouch he'd carried, but never opened in all his years of wandering. Inside was Daniel's last letter home, written just weeks before the battle where he'd disappeared. Samuel had read it so many times that he'd memorized every word, but he'd been unable to bear looking at Daniel's handwriting since receiving news of his death. With shaking hands, Samuel unfolded the letter and pointed to a specific passage. Mary read aloud, "Midnight's getting stronger every day. Yesterday he jumped a fence that was near 6 feet high, just because he saw a mare on the other side. I swear that horse has more personality than most people I know. He's got this funny habit of nudging my pocket when he wants sugar, and he always sleeps standing up unless there's danger. Then he lies down so he can get up fast if we need to run." Samuel looked at Midnight and reached toward his shirt pocket. The horse's response was immediate. He nudged Samuel's pocket gently, exactly as Daniel had described. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of absolute proof. "Test him," Samuel said to Pete. "Lie down near him and see what he does." Pete looked uncertain but followed Samuel's instructions, stretching out on the ground near Midnight's feet. The stallion's reaction was swift and protective. He moved to stand over Pete, his body positioning, creating a defensive barrier, while he remained alert for any approaching danger. The behavior was exactly what Daniel had described in his letter, Midnight's instinct to protect anyone who made themselves vulnerable in his presence. It was a trait that Daniel had encouraged and praised, turning it into a reliable behavior that no other horse would naturally exhibit. Mary's eyes filled with tears as she witnessed the demonstration. "He's been carrying your brother's memory all this time." Samuel nodded, feeling a complex mixture of grief and gratitude. Midnight represented the last piece of Daniel's life, the final connection to the brother he'd lost and mourned for so many years. But the horse also represented something more, evidence of Kane's crimes and perhaps the key to bringing the killer to justice. "Kane will come back," Samuel said, his voice now steady and determined. "And when he does, we'll be ready for him. This isn't just about protecting Midnight anymore. It's about making Kane pay for what he did to Daniel." Pete stood up and brushed the dust from his clothes, his young face set with resolve. "What do you need us to do?" Samuel looked at his unlikely family, Mary with her fierce loyalty, Pete with his eager courage, and Midnight with his patient strength. For the first time in 7 years, Samuel felt like he had something worth fighting for, something that connected him to his past, while pointing toward a future filled with purpose. "We send word to the Rangers about what we've discovered," Samuel said, "and we prepare for Kane's return. Because when he comes, we're not just defending a horse, we're defending justice for my brother and every other person Kane has killed." Thunder Midnight nickered softly, as if understanding that his long journey from war-torn battlefields to this peaceful town had led him exactly where he needed to be. He was home at last, reunited with the only family his fallen master had left behind, ready to help bring the man who'd killed Daniel Cartwright to face the justice he'd avoided for far too long. The hidden brand had revealed more than just ownership. It had uncovered a legacy of violence that stretched back years and would soon come to its final reckoning in the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge. The telegram to the Texas Rangers carried more urgency than any message Harold Finch had ever sent. Samuel had dictated it word by word, while Mary transcribed his newly recovered voice. each sentence building a case that transformed Kane from a mere horse thief into something far more sinister. Urgent. Have located missing cavalry horse from Civil War belonging to Daniel Cartwright, enlisted Union Army 1863. Horse bears Cartwright family brand, responds to trained behaviors described in soldiers' letters. Suspect Silas Kane murdered Cartwright for horse, been using forged papers for years. Kane, real name Cordwainer, wanted for multiple murders. Request immediate assistance, situation dangerous. Sheriff Tom Williams, Cedar Ridge Territory. Within hours, the response crackled back across the telegraph wires. Assistance en route, U.S. Marshal Davidson departing Fort Smith with 3 deputies. Estimated arrival 5 days. Maintain surveillance on suspect, but do not engage. Cordwainer, extremely dangerous. Protect evidence at all costs. 5 days. Samuel read the telegram with a mixture of relief and anxiety. Help was coming, but Kane could return at any time with hired guns and overwhelming force. The town would have to hold out until the federal marshals arrived, protecting both Midnight and the evidence that could finally bring Daniel's killer to justice. Sheriff Williams called a town meeting that evening, gathering Cedar Ridge's adult population in the schoolhouse to discuss their situation. The room buzzed with nervous energy as Williams explained what they were facing, not just a dispute over stolen property, but a confrontation with a multiple murderer who had everything to lose. "Folks," Williams began, his voice carrying the weight of his 15 years in law enforcement, "I won't lie to you. We're in a dangerous situation. Kane's got resources and experience we can't match, but we've got something he doesn't. We've got a community that looks after its own." Ezra Blackwood stood up, his massive frame commanding attention. "What do you need from us, Tom?" "Organization," Williams replied. "We need lookouts on all the roads leading into town. We need the women and children ready to take shelter if shooting starts. And we need every man who can handle a rifle ready to defend our home." Samuel listened to the planning with growing appreciation for the courage of these ordinary people. None of them were professional fighters, but they were willing to risk everything to protect what they believed was right. It reminded him of the biblical stories his father used to tell ordinary people called to extraordinary acts of faith. Old Doc Harrison raised his hand. "What about the horse? If Kane's really after him as evidence, maybe we should move him somewhere safer." "Where?" Mary asked. "Kane knows this territory, and we don't know who else might be working with him. Midnight's safest here, where we can protect him." Samuel stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly in the hushed spacer sound that many of them were hearing for the first time. "Midnight isn't just evidence," Samuel said. "He's family. My brother died protecting him, and I'll die before I let Kane take him again." The simple declaration sent a ripple of determination through the crowd. Here was a man who'd found his voice to defend his family's honor, and his courage became contagious. Pete Murphy stood next to Samuel, his young face set with resolve. "I'll help guard him. Mr. Samuel taught me how to handle horses, and I know Midnight trusts me." One by one, other voices joined the chorus of commitment. Mary volunteered to coordinate supplies and communication. Ezra offered to forge additional weapons and fortify strategic positions. Even Mrs. Henderson, the 70-year-old widow who ran the general store, declared her intention to contribute by preparing food for the defenders. As the meeting broke up and people dispersed to their assignments, Samuel found himself surrounded by a sense of community he hadn't experienced since before the fire. These people were risking their lives for him and Midnight, creating the kind of family bonds that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with choice. The next morning brought the first sign that Kane was preparing his return. A drifter rode into town with news that 3 men matching Kane's description had been seen in Millerville, asking questions about Cedar Ridge and recruiting local gun hands with promises of easy money. Said they needed men for a legal matter. The drifter reported to Sheriff Williams. Something about recovering stolen property, offered $20 a day, which is more than most cowboys see in a month. Samuel felt his jaw tighten at the news. Kane was building an army, using his stolen wealth to hire mercenaries who wouldn't ask questions about the legality or morality of their assignment. The odds were becoming increasingly stacked against Cedar Ridge's amateur defenders. But Samuel had learned something from his years of silence and his recent rediscovery of purpose. Sometimes the most important battles weren't about winning in any conventional sense. Sometimes they were about standing for something greater than yourself, regardless of the cost. He spent the afternoon with Midnight, working through the exercises Daniel had taught the horse during their time together. The stallion responded to commands given in a mixture of voice and gesture, his intelligence and training becoming more apparent with each session. "Midnight," Samuel said softly, using his brother's name for the horse for the first time. "Daniel would be proud of you. You survived everything they did to you, and you're still the noble animal he loved." Midnight's ears pricked forward at the sound of his true name, and Samuel could swear he saw recognition in the horse's dark eyes. Perhaps some part of Midnight remembered being called by that name in a different life, when his master was a young cavalryman who believed in honor and justice. Mary approached the corral carrying Samuel's evening meal, a routine that had developed naturally over the past weeks. But tonight, her face carried a gravity that spoke of difficult conversations ahead. "Samuel," she said, settling beside him on Ezra's handmade bench, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out before you respond." Samuel accepted the plate of food, but kept his attention focused on Mary's green eyes. Whatever she needed to say was clearly important to her. "I've been thinking about what happens after this is over," Mary continued. "Win or lose, your life here in Cedar Ridge is going to change. People know your story now. They know about Daniel and about your voice coming back. You can't go back to being the silent stranger who helps with horses." Samuel nodded, understanding her point. The events of the past few days had fundamentally altered his relationship with the community and with himself. The silence that had protected him for 7 years was no longer necessary or sustainable. "What I want to know," Mary said, her voice barely above a whisper, "is whether you plan to stay. After the marshals come and Kane is dealt with, will you make Cedar Ridge your permanent home?" The question struck Samuel in a place he'd thought was permanently closed off. For 7 years, he'd been a wanderer, moving from town to town without forming lasting attachments. The idea of putting down roots, of building a life instead of just surviving one, felt both terrifying and wonderful. Samuel began, then stopped. The truth was complex, layered with years of grief and recent hope. "I don't know if I remember how to stay in one place. I've been running for so long." Mary reached over and took his hand, her touch warm and steady. "Maybe it's time to stop running. Maybe it's time to start building something instead of just surviving." Samuel looked at her hand in his, then at Midnight, standing peacefully in the corral, then at the town spread out around them in the evening light. For the first time in 7 years, he could imagine a future that included more than just the next day's survival. "If we survive this," Samuel said carefully, "if Kane doesn't destroy everything we're trying to protect, then yes, I'd like to stay. I'd like to build something here." Mary's smile was radiant in the lamplight. "Then we better make sure we survive this." Pete arrived then, carrying news that sent chills through both of them. "Sheriff Williams wants to see you both. Right away, says there's been a development." They hurried to the sheriff's office to find Williams studying a new telegram with a grim expression. He looked up as they entered, his face pale in the lamplight. "Got word from the marshal's office in Fort Smith," Williams said. "Marshal Davidson's been delayed, won't be here for at least 8 days, maybe more. Seems there's been trouble with the Apache to the south, and all available federal officers have been diverted to deal with that situation." Samuel felt his heart sink. 8 more days of waiting, 8 more days for Kane to organize and plan his attack. The town's amateur defenses would have to hold far longer than anyone had anticipated. "There's more," Williams continued. "The Rangers sent additional information about Cordwainer's methods. Seems he's got a reputation for striking just before dawn, when people are tired and unprepared, uses overwhelming force to crush resistance quickly, then disappears before official help can arrive." "How many men can he field?" Samuel asked, though he dreaded the answer. Reports suggest he's traveled with as many as 12 hired guns at a time. Well-armed, experienced fighters who know how to follow orders without asking questions. The numbers were daunting. Cedar Ridge could muster perhaps 8 men with firearms experience, and most of them were farmers or tradesmen rather than fighters. Against 12 professional gunmen, their chances of success were slim at best. But Samuel found that the odds didn't diminish his resolve. If anything, the knowledge that they were facing overwhelming force only strengthened his determination to protect what mattered most. Daniel had faced similar odds at Gettysburg, and he died rather than abandon his post. "We need to be smart about this," Samuel said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "We can't match Kane's firepower, but we know this terrain, and he doesn't. We can choose the battleground." Sheriff Williams looked at Samuel with new respect. "What do you have in mind?" Samuel moved to the map on Williams's wall, studying the layout of Cedar Ridge and the surrounding area. His mind began working through possibilities, drawing on half-remembered military strategies from books he'd read and sermons he'd preached about biblical battles. "Kane wants midnight, which means he has to come to us," Samuel said, tracing lines on the map with his finger. "We control where the horse is, so we control where the fight happens. We make him come to us on our terms." As Samuel outlined his emerging plan, Mary watched him with growing admiration. This was a different man from the silent cowboy who'd arrived in Cedar Ridge months earlier. This was a leader discovering his calling, a protector finding his voice, a brother preparing to honor his family's memory with courage worthy of their sacrifice. The transformation wasn't complete yet, that would come with the test of actual battle. But Samuel Cartwright was emerging from 7 years of grief-imposed silence, and Cedar Ridge would be his proving ground. Outside, Midnight stood guard in his corral, ears alert for any sound that might signal approaching danger. The Stallion had survived war, theft, and abuse to find his way to this moment, and he seemed to understand that everything he'd endured had led to this final confrontation between justice and cruelty. The pieces were moving into position for a battle that would determine not just Midnight's fate, but the future of everyone who'd chosen to believe that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds against them. They came with the false dawn, just as Sheriff Williams had predicted. Samuel spotted the first dust cloud on the eastern horizon, while he stood watch from the church bell tower, his eyes straining against the grey light that preceded sunrise. 12 riders, moving in disciplined formation across the prairie towards Cedar Ridge. Kane had returned with an army. Samuel rang the church bell 3 times the signal they'd arranged to alert the town's defenders. Below him, Cedar Ridge came alive with purposeful movement as men and women rushed to their assigned positions. The plan they'd spent 3 days perfecting was about to face its ultimate test. Mary emerged from the saloon carrying a rifle almost as tall as herself, her green eyes blazing with determination despite her obvious fear. She'd insisted on taking a defensive position despite Samuel's protests, arguing that she could shoot as well as any man in town, and that Midnight needed every possible protector. Pete appeared at his post near the livery stable, clutching his father's old hunting rifle with white-knuckled intensity. The boy had grown years in the past week, his youthful enthusiasm tempered by the sobering reality of facing professional killers in defense of his makeshift family. Ezra Blackwood had transformed his smithy into a fortress, barricading the windows with iron plates and positioning himself where he could cover the main street with his double-barreled shotgun. The massive blacksmith's calm demeanor steadied everyone around him, his presence radiating the kind of quiet confidence that came from a lifetime of hard work and moral certainty. Sheriff Williams positioned himself at the opposite end of town from Samuel, creating a crossfire that would force any attackers to divide their attention. The sheriff's hands were steady on his rifle, but Samuel could see the weight of responsibility in the man's posture. 15 years of keeping peace through negotiation and compromise hadn't prepared him for open warfare. Samuel descended from the bell tower and made his way to Midnight's corral, where the Stallion waited with alert intelligence. The horse sensed the tension that gripped the town, his ears swiveling constantly as he monitored sounds that carried across the morning air. "Easy, boy," Samuel murmured, his voice carrying the calm authority he'd learned from years of working with frightened animals. "We're going to finish this today. One way or another, you'll be free." Midnight approached the fence and rested his great head against Samuel's shoulder, the gesture carrying all the trust and affection that had grown between them. For a moment, Samuel felt the weight of everything he was risking, not just his own life, but the lives of everyone who'd chosen to stand with him. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder as Kane's force crested the hill overlooking Cedar Ridge. Even at a distance, Samuel could see that these weren't ordinary drifters or cowboys. They rode in formation, their weapons visible and ready, their movements coordinated with military precision. Kane himself was unmistakable at the front of the group, his pale eyes scanning the town for signs of resistance. He'd shed any pretense of legal propriety now. This was a raid, pure and simple, designed to take what he wanted through overwhelming force. The riders paused at the edge of town, and Samuel could hear Kane's voice carrying across the morning air, though he couldn't make out the specific words. Orders were being given, positions assigned, escape routes planned. This wasn't Kane's first assault on a defended position. Samuel felt a strange calm settle over him as he watched the enemy force deploy. After 7 years of running from confrontation, of avoiding situations that might require him to take a stand, he found himself oddly peaceful in the face of certain violence. Perhaps this was what Daniel had felt at Gettysburg, the serenity that came from knowing you were exactly where you needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done. "Samuel," Mary's voice called from her position behind the saloon's reinforced walls. "They're moving." Kane's force had split into 3 groups. 4 men rode straight down the main street, while the others circled to approach from different angles. Classic tactics, designed to overwhelm defenders who might be expecting a frontal assault. Samuel checked his weapons one final time, his rifle, his revolver, and the knife that had belonged to his father. He'd also prepared something else, a cavalry bugle that Doc Harrison had kept from his own service in the Mexican War. If Samuel's plan worked, that bugle would signal the beginning of the end for Kane's criminal career. The first shots rang out as Kane's advance riders encountered Ezra's position at the smithy. The blacksmith's shotgun boomed like thunder, and one of the attackers tumbled from his saddle with a cry of pain and surprise. The battle for Cedar Ridge had begun. Samuel moved quickly to his own firing position, a carefully prepared spot behind the church where he could cover Midnight's corral while remaining hidden from the main street. His rifle was loaded and ready, his spare ammunition arranged within easy reach. Kane's voice cut through the gunfire, shouting orders that revealed his growing frustration. The resistance was stronger than he'd expected, the townspeople better organized and more determined than a simple raid should have encountered. A bullet splintered the wood inches from Samuel's head, reminding him that this wasn't a strategic exercise, but a life-and-death struggle. He returned fire carefully, aiming for the muzzle flashes that revealed his enemy's positions rather than trying for killing shots he wasn't trained to make. The sound of gunfire was constant now, a rolling thunder that echoed off the buildings and sent terrified animals throughout the town into frenzied flight. But through it all, Midnight remained calm in his corral, trusting Samuel to protect him from the violence that had claimed his first master. Pete's rifle cracked from his position near the livery, and Samuel saw one of Kane's flanking riders stagger in his saddle. The boy was holding his own despite his youth, proving that courage could overcome inexperience when the cause was just. But Kane's men were professionals, and they were beginning to adapt to the town's defenses. Samuel watched with growing concern as they coordinated their movements, using covering fire to advance from building to building toward Midnight's corral. The plan Samuel had developed depended on forcing Kane into a single, decisive confrontation, rather than allowing his superior numbers to grind down the defenders through attrition. It was time for the most dangerous part of the strategy, making himself the target that Kane couldn't resist. Samuel stood up from his protected position and walked deliberately into the open space near Midnight's corral. He was completely exposed now, an easy target for any of Cain's men, but he was also exactly where Cain needed him to be. "Cain!" Samuel shouted, his voice carrying clearly across the battlefield. "You want the horse? Come and take him." The gunfire slackened as Cain's attention focused on this unexpected development. Samuel could see the man's pale eyes fixed on him from across the street, calculating odds and measuring opportunities. "The famous mute cowboy found his voice," Cain called back, his tone mocking despite the carnage around him. "Too bad. You won't live long enough to say much more." Cain gestured to two of his men, and they began moving toward Samuel's position with their weapons raised. This was the moment Samuel had been preparing for, the chance to draw Cain's entire force into the killing ground he'd chosen. Samuel raised the cavalry bugle to his lips and blew the charge, the same call that Daniel would have heard at Gettysburg, the same notes that had summoned Union cavalry to 100 desperate battles. The sound seemed to freeze time for an instant, connecting past and present in a way that transcended the immediate violence. But the bugle call wasn't just symbolicit, was also a signal. As the last note faded, the crack of rifle fire erupted from unexpected positions throughout the town. Samuel's secret weapon wasn't superior firepower or military training, it was the element of surprise provided by defenders Cain hadn't known existed. The hidden defenders materialized from positions Cain's reconnaissance had missed entirely. Doc Harrison emerged from behind his clinic with a Spencer rifle. Mrs. Henderson appeared in her store's upper window with her late husband's military carbine, and 3 farmers who'd ridden in before dawn opened fire from carefully concealed positions on the town's outskirts. Cain's tactical advantage evaporated in seconds as his force found themselves caught in a crossfire they hadn't anticipated. But Cain himself was no amateur, survived too many battles to panic under pressure. His pale eyes swept the battlefield, quickly identifying the new threat positions and adapting his strategy accordingly. "Spread out," Cain bellowed to his remaining men. "They can't cover everything. Take the horse and kill anyone who tries to stop you." Samuel watched Cain's men reorganize with professional efficiency, their initial surprise giving way to the kind of coordinated response that spoke of extensive combat experience. The town's defenders had evened the odds, but this was far from over. 2 of Cain's gunmen broke from cover and rushed toward Midnight's corral, their weapons blazing as they tried to overwhelm Samuel's position through speed and firepower. Samuel dropped to one knee and fired carefully, his shot catching the lead attacker in the shoulder and spinning him around. But the second man kept coming, his revolver tracking towards Samuel with deadly intent. The crack of Pete's rifle from the livery stable saved Samuel's life, the bullet taking the charging gunman in the chest and dropping him face first into the dust. The boy had shown remarkable courage and skill under fire, proving that character mattered more than age when survival was at stake. But Cain had been using the assault on the corral as a diversion. While Samuel fought off the direct attack, Cain himself had circled around to approach from the blind side of the church. Samuel caught movement in his peripheral vision and turned to find Cain emerging from behind the building, his gun already drawn and aimed. "End of the line, preacher man," Cain said, his voice carrying the cold satisfaction of someone who'd finally cornered his prey. "You cost me time, money, and men. Now you're going to pay for all of it." Samuel faced Cain across 30 feet of dusty ground, his own weapon lowered but ready. This was the moment he'd been preparing for, since the discovery of Daniel's brand on Midnight's shoulder, the chance to face his brother's killer and demand justice for crimes that had gone unpunished for too long. "You murdered my brother," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the gun pointed at his heart. "Daniel Cartwright. You killed him and stole his horse." Cain's smile was sharp and humorless. "Cartwright. Yeah, I remember him. Young cavalry officer, thought he was some kind of hero. Put up quite a fight when I found him wounded after Gettysburg. Kept trying to protect that damn horse, even when he was bleeding to death." The casual cruelty in Cain's voice ignited something primal in Samuel's chest, a fury that had been building for 7 years. Fed by grief and loss, and the terrible knowledge that evil sometimes prospered while good men died, unremembered. "He was wounded?" Samuel asked, though part of him didn't want to know the details of his brother's final moments. "Cavalry charge went bad," Cain continued, clearly enjoying the pain his words were causing. "Found him pinned under his horse with a Confederate saber in his side. Could have put him out of his misery quick, but he kept fighting me for the animal, so I made it slow." Samuel felt his vision narrow to a tunnel that contained only Cain's face. The man wasn't just a killer, he was a sadist who had tortured Daniel before ending his life. The brother Samuel remembered, full of laughter and dreams, had died in agony at the hands of this monster. "Midnight," Samuel called suddenly, using the horse's true name for the first time in Cain's presence. The stallion's response was immediate and electric. At the sound of the name Daniel had given him, Midnight reared up on his hind legs with a scream of pure equine fury. The horse had recognized Cain's voice, had understood that this was the man who had killed his beloved master. Cain's attention wavered for just an instant as Midnight's scream pierced the air, and that instant was all Samuel needed. He brought his rifle up in a smooth motion, drawing on instincts he'd thought were buried forever. But Cain was fast too, and his gun was already aimed. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. Samuel felt the burn of Cain's bullet as it creased his ribs, spinning him partially around. But his own shot had found its mark. Cain staggered backward, his gun hand dropping as Samuel's bullet shattered his shoulder. Cain tried to raise his weapon again, his face twisted with pain and rage, but his injured arm wouldn't obey. Samuel stepped closer, his rifle trained on Cain's chest, and for the first time in the confrontation, Cain's pale eyes showed something that might have been fear. "You're going to hang for what you did to Daniel," Samuel said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction, "and to John Brennan, and to all the others whose deaths have gone unanswered." Cain's remaining men, seeing their leader wounded and the battle turning against them, began a fighting retreat toward their horses. The townspeople's superior positions and unexpected numbers had broken their confidence, and professional gunmen knew when to cut their losses. But Cain himself wasn't finished. As Samuel approached to disarm him, Cain's left hand darted to a hidden knife at his belt. The blade flashed in the morning sunlight as Cain lunged forward in a final, desperate attack. Samuel saw the knife coming, but couldn't bring his rifle around in time to block it. The blade was inches from his chest when Midnight exploded through the corral fence like a black thunderbolt. The stallion's shoulder caught Cain in mid-lunge, sending the killer flying through the air to land hard against the church wall. Cain's knife spun away into the dust as Midnight reared over him, hooves flashing with deadly intent. "Midnight, no," Samuel commanded, his voice carrying the same authority Daniel would have used. The stallion froze in mid-strike, his hooves hanging in the air inches from Cain's skull. For a long moment, horse and man stared at each other, the killer who had murdered his master and the animal who had every right to exact vengeance. But Midnight was more than his pain. He was the product of Daniel's patient training, the embodiment of a good man's belief that violence should always be the last resort rather than the first response. Slowly, deliberately, Midnight backed away from Cain's prostrate form. Cain lay unconscious against the church wall, blood seeping from wounds that were serious but not fatal. He would live to stand trial, to face justice for his crimes, to answer for the lives he'd destroyed. It was more mercy than he'd shown his victims, but it was the right choice, the choice Daniel would have made. Sheriff Williams approached with rope and shackles, his face grim with satisfaction. "Samuel, I've got to say, that was the finest piece of justice I've seen in 15 years of law enforcement." Samuel knelt beside Midnight and ran his hands along the horse's legs, checking for injuries from his charge through the fence. The stallion was unharmed, his magnificent spirit unbroken despite everything he'd endured. "Easy, boy," Samuel murmured. "It's over. You're safe now. We're both safe." Mary appeared at Samuel's side, her green eyes bright with unshed tears of relief and pride. She'd watched the entire confrontation from her position behind the saloon, had seen Samuel face down his brother's killer with courage that took her breath away. Pete ran over from the livery stable, his young face glowing with excitement and admiration. "Mr. Samuel, you did it. You got him." But Samuel was looking at Midnight, seeing in the horse's intelligent eyes the same peace that was settling into his own heart. The long journey that had begun with Daniel's death at Gettysburg was finally complete. Justice had been served, not through vengeance but through the kind of moral courage that honored the memory of good men everywhere. As the dust settled and the survivors counted their blessings, Samuel Cartwright stood with his hand on his brother's horse and felt something he hadn't experienced in 7 years. The quiet satisfaction that came from knowing he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The battle for Cedar Ridge was over, but the healing was just beginning. 6 months later, Samuel Cartwright stood in the same spot where he'd faced Cain's guns, but the scene around him had been transformed by peace and purpose. Where blood had once stained the dust, wild flowers now grew in colorful profusion. Where the sound of gunfire had echoed off building walls, children's laughter now filled the morning air. Midnight grazed peacefully in a newly expanded pasture behind the church, his magnificent coat gleaming in the spring sunshine. The scars were still there. They would always be there, but they no longer defined him. He was no longer a damaged creature bearing the marks of cruelty, but a proud stallion who had survived everything life could throw at him and emerged stronger for the experience. Ezra Blackwood had crafted a new saddle specifically for Midnight. The leather worked with intricate designs that told the story of the horse's journey from war to peace. The saddle bore no resemblance to the cruel contraption Cain had used. This was a thing of beauty and function, designed to honor the bond between horse and rider rather than enforce submission through pain. Samuel ran his hands over the smooth leather, appreciating the craftsmanship and the love that had gone into its creation. In 3 days, he would use this saddle for the first time, taking Midnight on a journey that would complete the circle of healing that had begun with Daniel's death so many years ago. The trial of Silas Cordwainer had been swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence of his crimes, including Daniel's letters, the hidden brand on Midnight, and testimony from multiple witnesses, Cain had been convicted on charges ranging from horse theft to first-degree murder. The judge had sentenced him to hang, and justice had been served in a Fort Smith courtroom with all the dignity and finality that the law could provide. Samuel had attended the trial, not out of vengeance but out of obligation to his brother's memory. He testified about the brand, about Midnight's behavioral responses, and about the evidence that connected Cain to Daniel's murder. When the verdict was read, Samuel had felt not triumph but relief. The long hunt for justice was finally over. Mary emerged from the church carrying a simple bouquet of wild flowers, her wedding dress, a vision of white silk and lace that transformed her from the practical saloon owner into something approaching an angel. In an hour, she would become Mrs. Samuel Cartwright, in a ceremony that would unite not just 2 hearts but 2 souls who had found healing in each other's love. "Second thoughts?" Mary asked with a smile that held just enough mischief to let Samuel know she was teasing. "Not a one," Samuel replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had found his place in the world. "Though I still can't quite believe you agreed to marry a former preacher who spent 7 years refusing to speak to God or anyone else." Mary reached up and straightened his tie, her touch gentle and possessive. "I'm marrying the man who found his voice to defend what he loved. The man who stood up to killers and thieves because it was the right thing to do. The man who taught a wounded horse to trust again." Pete Murphy appeared around the corner of the church, resplendent in his first adult suit and grinning with the excitement of someone who'd been entrusted with important responsibilities. At 17, Pete had grown into the kind of man his father would have been proud of, honest, hard-working, and possessed of a moral courage that had been tested and proven in the crucible of real danger. "Everyone's ready inside," Pete announced. "Doc Harrison says he's been practicing the wedding march on that old organ until his neighbors are ready to shoot him, and Sheriff Williams keeps checking his watch like he's afraid you might run off." Samuel laughed, a sound that had become common in Cedar Ridge over the past months. The return of his voice had been accompanied by the return of his capacity for joy, and the townspeople had grown accustomed to seeing their former silent protector smile and laugh with the spontaneity of someone who had rediscovered what it meant to truly live. "Tell them we'll be right in," Samuel said. "I just want a moment with Midnight first." Pete nodded understanding and disappeared back into the church, leaving Samuel and Mary alone with the horse who had made their love story possible. Midnight approached the fence at Samuel's call, his movements fluid and graceful despite the reminders of past trauma that would always mark his body. Samuel reached into his pocket and withdrew a small carved horse knot, the one he'd given Midnight during their first tentative moments of connection, but a new one he'd completed just that morning. This carving depicted not a generic horse, but Midnight specifically, capturing the stallion's noble bearing and indomitable spirit in smooth lines of polished wood. "A wedding gift," Samuel explained to Mary as he offered the carving to Midnight. "For the horse who brought us together." Midnight sniffed the wooden figure delicately, then allowed Samuel to place it on the fence post, where it would remain as a permanent reminder of the bond between them. The stallion's dark eyes held intelligence and contentment, the look of a creature who had found his place in the world and knew himself to be loved. The church bell began to ring, calling the community to witness the union of two souls who had found each other through shared trials and mutual healing. Samuel offered Mary his arm, and together they walked toward the church where their friends and neighbors waited to celebrate the beginning of their new life together. As they passed Midnight's pasture, the stallion nickered softly, not the scream of pain and fury that had once defined him, but the gentle greeting of a horse calling to his family. Samuel paused to acknowledge the sound with a nod and a smile, then continued toward the church door. Inside, the entire population of Cedar Ridge had gathered to witness the ceremony. Ezra Blackwood stood as Samuel's best man, his massive frame squeezed into his finest clothes. Mrs. Henderson served as Mary's matron of honor, her stern features softened by genuine affection for the bride. Sheriff Williams waited at the altar with his Bible open, ready to perform his first wedding ceremony in his 15 years of law enforcement. Doc Harrison's organ playing filled the small sanctuary with music that spoke of new beginnings and eternal promises. As Samuel and Mary walked down the aisle together, past the faces of people who had risked their lives to protect what was right, Samuel felt a profound sense of coming home. The vows they exchanged were simple but heartfelt, spoken in voices that carried clearly to every corner of the church. When Sheriff Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the congregation erupted in applause and cheers that could probably be heard all the way to the next county. Later, as the celebration moved to the copper dollar for food and dancing, Samuel found himself standing on the saloon's front porch with Pete, watching Midnight graze peacefully in the distance. The boy had become like a son to Samuel, learning not just the craft of horse training, but the deeper lessons about character and courage that would serve him well throughout his life. "What happens now?" Pete asked, echoing the same question Mary had posed months earlier. Samuel considered the question while watching his wife laugh with Mrs. Henderson over some private joke. Tomorrow, he would begin his new role as Cedar Ridge's official minister, serving a congregation that had already seen him at his worst and accepted him despite his flaws. Next week, he and Mary would travel to Missouri to visit Daniel's grave and introduce Midnight to the place where his journey had begun. But tonight was for celebration, for gratitude, for the recognition that healing was possible even for the most wounded among them. Tonight was for acknowledging that love could triumph over loss, that communities could stand together against injustice, and that sometimes the most broken things became the strongest once they were properly mended. "Now we live," Samuel said simply. "We build something worth protecting, and we remember that every day is a gift that shouldn't be wasted on old grievances or future fears." Pete nodded with the wisdom of someone who had learned profound truths at an unusually young age. "And Midnight?" Samuel smiled as he watched the stallion move through his pasture with the fluid grace of a creature completely at peace with his environment. "Midnight gets to be what Daniel always intended him to be, horse, who knows he's loved, who has a home where he belongs and who can trust that tomorrow will be better than yesterday. As the sun set over Cedar Ridge, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel Cartwright stood with his makeshift family and felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing he was exactly where he belonged. The silence that had defined 7 years of his life had been replaced by laughter, conversation, and the comfortable sounds of a community at peace. Thunder Midnight had taught them all that survival was just the beginning of the story. The real triumph came in learning to trust again, to love again, to believe that broken things could be made whole through patience, kindness, and the unwavering commitment to doing what was right, regardless of the cost. In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, its voice carrying across the empty plains with a sound that spoke of wildness and freedom. But tonight, that wildness felt like a celebration rather than a threat, a reminder that some things would always remain untamed, and that was exactly as it should be. Samuel Cartwright, former preacher, former silent wanderer, current husband and community leader, listened to that wild call and smiled. He had found his voice again, had found his place in the world, and had discovered that healing was possible even for the most damaged among them. Some wounds, he knew now, were not meant to disappear entirely. They were meant to become part of the story, reminders of what had been survived and overcome. Like midnight scars, they could be transformed from symbols of trauma into badges of courage, proof that love was stronger than cruelty and that hope could flourish even in the darkest circumstances. The wild stallion had been tamed not through force but through understanding, not through breaking but through healing. And in learning to trust again, Midnight had taught an entire community that redemption was possible for anyone willing to believe in the power of second chances. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Samuel took his wife's hand and looked toward tomorrow with the quiet confidence of a man who had learned that the best chapters of any story were often written after everything seemed lost. They had survived the storm, and now they were free to build something beautiful in the calm that followed.